here it is. Shots fired by Tom Rowsell, who calls himself Survive the Jive. And let me just play
We're
these
being
real quick.
trolled, I guess is a way of describing it, right?
Yes. Let me just play this original video and then we can start talking. Because Mark and I, last night, we listened to a number of interviews of Survive the Jive, and we
Oh,
watched some of his presentation.
we listened to some of his material, but I can't claim to have a sort of deep familiarity with all his positions, for example. But he evidently has no familiarity with our positions. So if we happen to
Yes.
misrepresent him, then I guess I don't know. I guess I'm not that upset about that.
Here's his comments. So he's actually visiting the temple of Hephaestus in Greece. So he's on vacation. Interesting.
Certain people on the internet like to make a cult of Apollo, which is quite distinct from the ancient cult, and they regard Apollo in a way that would have been quite surprising to any of the people of the time when he was actually worshipped, because their reason for focusing on Apollo above all other gods is they consider him to be more Aryan, and by that they mean Indo-European rather than Indo-Iranian, which is what the word really means. But they think that, I don't know why, because he was a god probably imported to Greek worship from Anatolia. Doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't Indo-European on origin, but certainly he's possibly not from Europe. And of course he's also gay. He is a god who is well attested in mythology as doing gay things. So yeah, if you want to worship Apollo, that's fine, but I just think worship Apollo, the god as he is actually known, and not this fake Apollo that they just made up. These kind of people, if you don't know who I'm talking about, then don't worry about it. They're not important anyway, but there's just some funny people on the internet who've invented a cult of Apollo because they consider that, and none of these people are Greek anyway, they're all Americans, likely of British descent and Germanic descent, who say that Odin is invented by the Jews and Norse mythology is Jewish, but the real god of the Northern Europeans is Apollo. And they don't really have any evidence to support that absurd claim, but they're not the sort of people who really care about evidence.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I have to say about that, Richard, is rent free, bitch. Living
yes.
in the guy's head. I mean, we don't think about him. I was unaware of how to pronounce the guy's name before this clip, stood up, and yet he's such a pussy. He doesn't even mention us by name. You know what I mean?
I have to say, I really do dislike that. Yeah. The other thing I would remind Tom of these, they're just people on the internet. I would be curious how he is not a person on the internet. He has a master's degree in medieval studies, which is great. He does a lot of videos where he takes photography and footage from other sources or stock sources that I presume he purchases or something, and creates these videos that seem almost like Netflix specials about the history of English paganism or the Druids or etc. That's all fine. I remember watching his video on the Sky God and Zeus, Deus, etc. It was informative, if a bit Wikipedian, I must say, but I don't understand how he is
he's
not
a book reporter. He's a book reporter. This guy's a book reporter.
It's a book report nationalism. I don't understand how he's not an internet person, or he's somehow more important and can't bring himself to mention our names. I mean, I think it's safe to say that he's clearly addressing this at Mark and myself, or maybe he, I don't know, who knows, also the broader kind of people on Twitter who are associating themselves with Apolloism, etc. But I'll just I'll start out with that. I've never been hostile towards him. I've never said an unkind word towards him before this, but he obviously feels very threatened if something is ridiculous or something like that. It's just a bunch of Americans. I mean, coming up with some weird cult about a gay person who they think is Northern European. That's obviously a maybe some kernels of the making up a new religion. I think that's something we might want to dilate on, but it's obviously a mischaracterization. So why are you saying it? I mean, Tom surely is intelligent enough to know that he's mischaracterizing us. So why are you saying this? The other curious thing, and I'll just add this in to Tom, because, and granted, I might be doing a little concerned trolling myself, but I think he's moved away from this. I did a brief look through just Google searches and so on about the colleagues he's working with, but he seems to have had a connection with Greg Johnson, and I think he's moved away from it over the past 2 years. I don't see them collaborating too much, but I would remind him that homophobia is not tolerated among gay Nazi groups, like Greg Johnson. So I would tread lightly, Tom. You don't want to lose those associations with all these wonderful people. But yeah, homophobia
and gay behavior,
tolerated.
like making little snipes like this and not even daring to mention us by name, right? I mean, this kid also. So here's the origin of this conflict, if you can call it that. Tom read some article of mine, and this was around the time, it was a while ago, right? And you're better with dates than I am, Richard, so you can fill in the blanks here. But so we had that debate. It was more of just a kind of friendly discussion with Stephen McNallen, who's the leading Odinist in not only North America, probably the world. So he's he is knowledgeable in Norse mythology. Mm-hmm. And we had a friendly discussion with him, and I put forth my thesis, which I don't think has effectively been refuted. And I actually think that the thesis I think that he's actually kind of, because I think that he may have reacted to that, because we were watching a video, and it seems that he's now taking a cynical view of Snorri Sturluson, right? He's kind of like, Snorri Sturluson should not really be representative of Norse myth now, right? Well, Snorri Sturluson is where we get all our information about Norse myth. He's a primary text of Norse myth. Emerging, Snorri Sturluson was himself a Christian merchant. I think it's probable, or possible at least, that he was a crypto Jew. If you read, in Norse mythology itself is a kind of brilliant mythology that I think that was probably invented by Jews, right? I mean, that's my thesis, and I think, and I have a number of reasons to back that up. The mythology itself seems to be referential both to the Hebrew Bible and to the New Testament, right? So, for example, with Leviathan, we see the equivalent with the Midgard serpent. They're both kind of slain in Ragnarok. We see Balder, who's recognized by mythographers as being kind of a reference either to Adonis or Jesus. He dies, and his death brings about this apocalypse, and then he appears at the end of the apocalypse. And after all the gods have died, i.e., paganism has died, and now the world is ruled by this one Christ-like figure named Balder. There's a garden of Idun, or rather, there's a character, a goddess named Idun, who is a goddess of golden apples, right? And mythographers recognize this as probably being a reference to the Garden of Eden, right? Hebrew is discussed in the preface of Snorri Sturluson's opus, which is the foundation of Norse mythology, the Prosetta, right? So my thesis is a strong one, and it's the most plausible explanation for that myth body. Now, he says that I have no evidence for it, but there is actually no rebuttal. I mean, I'm unaware of him like critiquing my specific arguments on this point, but it's a composite myth, so it's a derivative of earlier myth bodies, including the Hebrew Bible, but also including Norse mythology. It's a kind of characteristic work of gem, I would argue, right?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it doesn't seem like Aryans should be following it is because the god Odin is an equivalent, has long been recognized even through the medieval period as an equivalent to Mercury, right? He's the kind of proto-Jewish god, essentially. He's a deceiver, he's a psychopomp, he's he brings them to Valhalla. He has similarities to Jesus as well. He hangs on a tree, right? And if you look at the Greek in the New Testament, the cross is also described as a tree. So this is a reference, and this shit is young, right? It's relatively young. So even the first fixed runestone in Northern Europe is like 300 AD, right? So the influence is coming from Christianity, the Hebrew Bible. There's other influences there as well, but it's a kind of skilled work of symbolism, right? It's a symbol-wise myth body that's been developed that's referencing earlier myth bodies. It's much in the way that other, earlier myth bodies are developed, whether it's Greek mythology or the Greek myth body and so forth, right? And the other thing I should say too is that the claim that I'm not arguing, for example, that the Greco-Roman religion is free of like some kind of Semitic influence. I think that that's absurd, right? I mean, I think that there's gem also in the Greco-Roman myth body as well, right?
Yes.
We're talking about a symbol-wise people, an intelligent symbol-wise people that are certainly more literate and able to create something like this than illiterate, Viking barbarians, right? So this, I argue, is the origin of the myth body. And I think that the claim, I think it's the most plausible. And I'm not going to kind of dilate fully and give my full thesis here, but that's the kind of general thesis, right? And
yeah.
I think
let me jump in here. I mean, because we don't know, and there's not going to be, I doubt it, ever any kind of smoking gun evidence of a claim that Odinism or Germanic paganism is a kind of Christianized or Judaized myth form. There's not going to be smoking gun evidence. The way you can establish
what would be the requirement, though? What would be the requirement for that?
Well, some letter.
Would we need a time machine or
a time machine or some diary entry of, I've really fooled them this time. They don't know I'm Jewish and that they're worshiping Mercury. Ha ha ha. I mean, obviously, nothing like that is going to be found, and so you can use. Well,
he's explicitly identified with Mercury. Now, the question then becomes:
Tacitus said that the Germans are worshiping Mercury. Now, he was writing for a Roman
Mercury
audience.
And Hercules, right? Yeah,
and Hercules, yeah.
Yeah,
but and also, like, you can see this in the. I mean, this is a very simple example of this, but you can see this in the days of the week. In French, mercredi is our Wednesday. That's obviously it's a Mercury's day. Our day is Wednesday, and it's a little bit difficult to see it, but that actually is Odin's day or Wotan's day. So this is these you can see just through something like the days of the week, there's this interpretation and connection between Odin and Mercury. I think there's probably some interesting connection between Odin and Bacchus in terms of a god of frenzy and madness as well. But that's by and by. But I mean, this is the way that you can engage in informed speculation about the past, and you can understand that these things are parabolic and that they aren't like historical documents. I mean, we can look at Jesus Christ and see very clear parallels that he is a figure coming out of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah and Daniel especially, but all over the Hebrew Bible. He's also related to David, as the genealogy in Matthew and Luke, I think, say. So he's coming out of that text. And then you can also look at his deeds and the way he is depicted and begin associating him with other gods. It's a god who turns water into wine. It's a god who descends into hell and rises again. Is he connected on the first case with a god like Bacchus? Might there be a Adonis or dying and rising god quality to him of, Adonis who's beloved by Aphrodite, and he has to die and go into the underworld and visit Persephone for a while, and they have a love affair, and then he comes back again. So there's a kind of cyclical and seasonal aspect that you can see that myth repeated in the Gospels of Jesus Christ and just the image of Jesus Christ that we've inherited from Christianity. So no, we can't know any of this for certain, but we can engage in a kind of mythic genealogy, so to speak, or a kind of informed speculation about where these things are coming from and where and their kind of evolution and change through connections with pre-existing myths. And you can also try to reach a kind of dating process of, aspects of the Hebrew. I mean, this is the most obvious one, but the flood narrative, is that a kind of spin on Gilgamesh, which is assuredly written and propagated centuries before the Hebrew Bible? Can you kind of then start to kind of date these things and see one as a kind of evolution or spinoff or critique even of earlier myths? So these are the tools that we have at hand. This is the material that we have at hand, and this is how we can do things. And he's also just he's like, what I see from people like this is that they want to engage in some kind of rehearsal. So we were listening to some other interviews by him, and he's like, well, I was as a young Catholic schoolboy, I was attracted to Greek myths and so on, but I'm not Greek, and so I have to dedicate myself to English paganism or Germanic paganism, etc. And it's kind of like, well, no, you don't actually. You're just engaging in some sort of petty nationalism, in this way. Like I'm going to engage in the religion of my forefathers, and not the Christian one, of course, but I'm going to go back to this one point that I've discovered, and that's true. And I'm going to engage in a kind of rehearsal of what they did. That is entirely unnecessary. And indeed, in Tom's own, YouTube Wikipedian videos on the progress of Aryans throughout the ages, you see evolution, you see movement, you see conquest and domination, you see ethnic cleansing all over the place. This is a people of movement and change and evolution. And to fixate on one period in time and then think you're like authentic because you are obsessed with this one moment of our history, and that you can't in a way be inspired by other moments, or at least recognize that there's transition and change, and creatively try to reach something that would resonate with people in the 21st century. You just kind of can't do that because it's not authentic. I mean, I'm just going to be frank. This reminds me of like goofy, dumb Civil War reenactors, or just like these goofballs who want to like cling to tradition in an antiquarian fashion. And in the words of Nietzsche, they think of history as a way of smelling the furniture of the past. And if he wants to do that, and if he wants to engage in, I don't know, some druid worship or Odinism, like knock yourself out. I don't really have a problem with that, but let's recognize it for what it is. You know next to nothing about what you are practicing. And again, he is a practicing pagan. So I'm not like, insulting him by claiming that he's just going out in the woods and running around the fire and listening to black metal.
So he is criticizing
he is a practicing
us
pagan. You have no earthly idea what actual practices were. You can only use informed speculation. And you're kind of fixating on this thing as a kind of new mystery cult. It's like, you don't know what this is about. You don't know what they're doing. You're just rehearsing it and reiterating it without actually like critically evaluating it, or, heaven forbid, creatively attempting to generate a religion that is actually relevant for people living in the 21st century, as opposed to goofballs who want to, reinvent the Middle Ages or God knows what. All right, end of rant.
Yeah, I mean, he's criticizing us essentially for not being a cargo cult, right? Because and he doesn't have familiarity with us. So if we happen to misrepresent him, he's misrepresented us, and based on a lack of familiarity, it would seem. Nowhere do we state or do we aspire to be recreating the Apollo cult in some perfect manner. I mean, we're actually critical of a lot of the myths and rituals, right? And we're looking at them in a kind of critical manner to sort of decipher what their significance is. And so we're not just going to kind of blindly sort of follow the rituals of ancients, in some of these mystery cults, because we want to know what the significance of these symbols are and what they mean and in what they signify and their sort of psychic and spiritual power. Should symbolically, is it actually, something that is healthy for us to be making this ritualistic gesture, for example? Or, we want to understand the symbols, right? So this is a work of deconstruction to some extent, a work of analysis, and then eventually a work of construction based on an agreed upon knowledge of symbols. So that's more our project. We're not just hoping to kind of like, LARP basically, as people at the Temple of Delphi, thousands of years ago, in rituals that actually can't be recreated because there's not enough information really to kind of piece them together in a completely accurate manner. I mean, they can be roughly sort of recreated, but then we have to wonder, well, what do these symbols represent? What does this symbolism represent? Are we interested in recreating it? What is it saying? And I think that these symbols can be understood. And for example, I think that Jews are a symbol-wise group, and I think that they understand their religion. It might be mysterious to us, but I think that they, not all Jews, of course, understand their religion, and probably the majority of Jews don't understand their religion. But I think that there is a kind of core of knowers, Gnostics, whatever term you want to use, who understand their religion. And if you're going to practice religion, you should understand your religion. So that's more of our project, and he's ignorant of what our project is. So the guy's claiming, and he's, I mean, his critique is so primitive and stupid. I just don't even really know where to begin. So he's saying that we're Americans, so that we shouldn't be practicing a Mediterranean religion, for example. But he says in the same critique that it may have started in Anatolia, right? I don't know if that's accurate, but if it started in Anatolia, it was Indo-European, or it was Aryan, whatever term. Now he's getting fussy about this term Aryan, right? Which is a completely valid and legitimate term. Though I think actually the better term is Apollonian. I would advocate for the term Apollonian. But I think it's certainly a kind of sufficient term, and it describes what we're getting at, and it is a racial characterization of Apollo. Apollo is a blonde god, a Hyperborean god, a northern invader. He's described very clearly in physical terms as an Aryan figure, northern descended Hyperborean, more clearly than any of the gods in the Norse myth, right? I mean, again, Odin appears to be a kind of Semitic figure. Thor as well, I would say, is a Semitic figure. And I would say that the myth genealogy there, he derives ultimately from an Idaean cult on Crete, most likely, as a dactyl there named Hercules, who will then become the familiar Hercules, who's the hero wearing the club. He starts off as a smith-forged dwarf of sorts, an attendant of Vulcan, so an equivalent to Vulcan. And this accounts for the hammer that Thor will have later in the myths in the Norse mythology. And this transition, this transition from Hercules worship to Thor worship happens during the migration period, where we see the clubs of Thor being replaced by or rather the clubs of Hercules being replaced by the hammers of Thor. It happens during a period of Christianization, actually, in fact. And I make the argument that the Norse myth may represent a kind of Christian rock, a way of getting, a kind of more badass myth to kind of indoctrinate these barbarians in a kind of more subliminal fashion toward Christianity.
Christian rock is a really good analogy.
Yeah, that's a kind of theory as to why this developed, why this exists. So it becomes a way of like, getting them comfortable with a hanging god, essentially, which is what Christ is, right? So in the idea that Odin as a hanging god predates Jesus, it's just ridiculous. It's just like a cope. It's just a cope. You know what I mean? And it's like, and honestly, we're all descended from barbarians. Even Jews, of course, at some point are descended from barbarians, but they're a more urban people, and they've been an urban people for a longer period of time. And they're myth bearers, and they're kind of skilled at the development of parable and the use of symbol. You just got to give them credit. You know what I mean? And so this is most likely what's occurring with this myth body. And I don't know. I guess the guy has now backed off Snorri Sturluson, right? So I don't know if he's still promoting Thor or not. I don't know what the guy's doing. I think he's retreated into like studying the most primitive manifestation of these sort of Proto-Indo-Europeans or these Proto-Aryans, and so he's studying our ancestors at their kind of most primitive point, which is interesting from a kind of archaeological perspective. If the guy, didn't want to fuck with me ever, then that would be fine. I think the guy can.
We don't have a problem with any of that.
Yeah, that's cool. That stuff's interesting, but it's like if you're presenting that as a kind of ideal that we should revert to, like, steppe tribes, these barbaric steppe tribes or whatever, that we should just go full grug mode. Is that, and this is something that Nietzsche warned against, this idea of Vikingism is what he called it. But he seems to be promoting a kind of primitivism or barbarianism, which is just grug, dumb. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's my sense of it.
Yeah.
So he's saying Apollo's from Anatolia. Who knows? That may be the case. No one really knows. He's an Aryan figure, as I've already described, in certainly in the Greco-Roman context, as he develops as his figure Apollo. But there are earlier precedents in Sumerian myth, for example. We have Shamash, who's a sun god. His name actually is still in the Hebrew, right? It's the word for sun in the Hebrew. And he's an early form. He's a kind of proto-Apollo. He's got the chariot, whole deal, right? So, but certainly as he develops, and there as well, I would argue as well. But he develops into a kind of Aryan figure. He was equated by Herodotus with Ra and Horus and these sun gods. He has a solar aspect to him. He's an Aryan figure. But yeah, so the idea that we're in America. So yeah, let's say he was from Anatolia, but then he ended up in Greece, and he ended up in Rome, and then he was worshipped in different forms by the Gauls, and by the Germans, right? So it seems like the god got around. He was moving around. So
do you think he might referring to, they're all like Celtic prehistorical cultures in Anatolia? Do you think he might be referring to that?
No. Well,
the Ikera.
No, I don't know exactly. I'd have to look at that again. But you're right. I think that might be later, though. I think that's like 3rd century BC. But it doesn't matter. There were racial. There's racial migrations, right? And that's essentially what he describes in his video, is that there's these kind of racial migrations. But religions are also portable, of course. There are Christians in America, but Jesus was in ancient Jerusalem and Galilee. So how's that work? Shouldn't only people that live in Galilee,
because we're American, should we embrace Native American spirituality or something?
It's just the guy is just not coherent, basically. He's kind of mindless. I mean, he acts kind of pretentious and like he's a badass, but he's kind of dumb. I mean, his critique is very dumb, if I'm being honest. And I think that he's getting irritated by us because people are saying, "Oh, Brahman's got some interesting ideas. What do you think?" And they're spamming the guy's chat or something. So now the guy's getting pissed off. You know what I mean? Good. Yeah. We're here to stay. We're going to take over, dude. Sorry. And the other thing, his other critique about Apollo being homosexual, gay, because a lot of the grugs that follow his content that are like, yeah, we should return to being step idiots or whatever. So those people, who are interested in these pre-civilizational religions for which we have almost no knowledge, right? Forget about reconstructing Rome and Greece, where there were actual civilizations, where people built temples that we still have today. And they weren't just like, I mean, I don't want to go to like E. Michael Jones here, but, it was a relatively primitive barbaric conditions in Northern Europe at that point, right? And, and it seems like he wants to kind of veer more in that direction. Where I think again he's moved off the Norse stuff, or at least Snorri Sturluson, which is the Bible. It's the source. It's the main source of that stuff. So he's moved off that, and now he's talking about these carvings in tombs of solar wheels, and like, so now at least he's kind of like, so all our takes are picked up at some point by other people in the DR. They eventually come to us, right? So he's leaning into this solar cult now. But it's primitive, and they're not people that are civilizational people, so they're not kind of imitable people, unless you're one of these kind of DR like collapsitarians and think that we should like move out into the woods and abandon the political struggle or this sort of thing. That might be your position, and but it is a grug level position, and and it's not in religion. We look at Christianity, for example. Christianity clearly had a kind of religio-political goal ultimately. As does Judaism, and and it manifested as something powerful in the world, and that seems like a good goal for religion, to be power-seeking, to be involved in civilization and the construction of civilization and culture, and to work towards the amelioration and survival of positive forms of culture and civilization. That should be the goal of religion. It shouldn't be just retreating out into the woods and getting a bunch of grugs psyched about some caveman carvings. So I mean, I think that it is true. We are not alike, Tom. You and I, we're not alike. But to address the homosexual question, right? Because this is the thing that. This is his real like a gotcha. Oh, Tom, were there gay guys in Greece? Come on, dude. No, there weren't gay guys in Greece. That's impossible. Yeah, we were aware that there were homosexuals in Greece, and we were aware that there is a kind of pederastic. There was a cult of pederasty in Greece as well that had an origin, especially in Crete, and also Thebes. And we don't consider that origin to be Aryan, to be gentle about it. And that represents a kind of period of time in Greek history, and there was a pre-period when that wasn't practiced. But we look at some of the myths, some of the myths which appear to have a kind of Semitic inflection or influence, including Homer, right? Including the Homeric hymns. There's messaging in there that essentially fits Gem. This is the kind of cleverness and intelligence of these, what we would call proto-Jews, I think, at that point. So that they're involved early on in the development of Greek culture. Now, at what point, are they there at the formation of, for example, the cult of Apollo or the cult of Zeus? It's possible, certainly. Or do these represent kind of corruptions of an earlier development? That's also possible. I mean, certainly what we do see there in the cult of Zeus and Apollo is that we see that Earth Mother gods and chthonic serpent gods are overthrown for figures that represent Aryans, essentially, that have or sky gods, celestial sky gods that represent Aryans, and that is clear. Apollo being one of them. So the cultic pederasty, it is something that develops in Greece, of course, but these things actually develop when you have a civilization, when you actually have power in the world. You do develop these kind of decadent aspects of your civilization over a period of time. There's also something called civilizational decline, where these things develop. These kind of maladies, you could argue, right? So I mean, think before you talk, dude. Because the other thing too, I would say about you, Tom, is that Tom, you came in and attacked my argument, and I said, okay, cool, let's get on a stream and have a friendly, cordial discussion of this. You fled, right? Tell your barbarian brothers that, dude. And hail Apollo, bitch.
Can I ask Richard a question?
Sure.
You said did you mention that Bacchus was the analogous Roman god to Odin?
I was suggesting he might be. The clear analogy in Roman interpretation is Mercury.
Okay, because I was thinking,
but I'm suggesting that there might be he might be a little bit of a composite god, or at least there's a elective affinities at the very least between Bacchus and Odin, god of madness and frenzy.
Yeah, because I've always thought of Odin as this almost like fatherly figure, where he's like very wise, and he's partly blind, and he has these two ravens who sits on his shoulders, and who scour the earth. So I always thought of him as sort of like a fatherly figure, whereas Bacchus is sort of like this degenerate god who like parts or whatever.
Right. Well, certainly in Wagner's ring
Bacchus
cycle
also has this. Richard, Bacchus also has a spear as one of his attributes. I mean, that's one of the spear is also a primary attribute of Odin. Odin throws a spear. I think it's called Gungur or something like this. He throws a spear and over opposing warriors as a way of claiming the dead, right? As claiming the warriors for the Valkyries and ascent into Valhalla.
Yeah, Bartomeu, I wouldn't also underestimate the influence of Richard Wagner on how we now perceive the Germanic pantheon. And
I agree.
Wagner himself, in a good way. I mean, look, I love Wagner and Nietzsche. I like it's the Israeli Palestinian conflict of philosophy, but I choose to like both. He's obviously an amazing artist. I mean, he was taking the material of Germanic paganism, changing it in very clear ways, and kind of making it his own, and creating great art, but creating a German national myth that would lead to a revolution and a new world. I mean, he was an amazing figure. But yes, there's no doubt that he is Odin or Wotan in Wagnerian opera seems, in terms of his personality at the very least, seems a lot closer to a figure like Zeus or so on. And he's, of course, that whole opera cycle is about him kind of giving way to man, having his, creating a man without fear, and who will, wed Brunhilde, having his spear, broken as almost a kind of castration motif, you could say. But I mean, I think we sometimes don't recognize the degree to which artists who radically changed things and kind of reinvented these figures, they become the assumption later on, and I think Wagner is a monumental figure in that regard.
Yeah, I agree completely that I forgot to say that Jim Goes has repeated, but it's quote someone else where he says that I don't know a lot of stuff, but I suspect a lot of things. And I feel a bit of like that with ancient mythology, where I got the feeling that I can't really prove this, but I get the feeling that a lot of the what you might call like ancient Greek or ancient Germanic paganism, it's stuff that were invented in the 1800s and by people who came after, and it doesn't really have a lot of historical lineage to. And also, like Mark, you should probably not say Snorre as much because that means dick in Scandinavian languages.
What is the guy's? Isn't that the pronunciation of his name?
Snorre.
Snorre is the pronunciation of his name.
Yeah.
Is that right? As
Yeah, but you should probably just say the last name because it might be a bit. It's like calling. Yeah, it's like calling someone a cock or something.
Is Snorre, it means cock, or Snorri means cock? Or both?
Both. Or you had like the wrong pronunciation, but yeah, it means
okay.
Okay. Well, you know, fair. Mark is famous for mispronouncing words. Yeah, I wouldn't hold that against him. I just real quick.
Well, Richard, did you want to talk about the Platonist?
I was going to throw that out there. I think
why don't you?
I don't have enough time. I've got to go. I've got to run an errand in about 20 minutes, but I would just mention this thing. I don't even know quite what to make of it, other than I find it extremely incoherent and kind of LARPy. In another way, philosophically LARPy. So Tom mentioned that after he got his master's in medieval studies, he began reading philosophy, and he took to Plato and Nietzsche. Here, you know, I see a very similar story to my own coming out of undergraduate college, and that's all fine and good. He was in this podcast discussion that Mark and I were listening to last night, and it's very funny because on one level, he wants to engage in this recreation or rehearsal of older myths. On the another level, he seems to be engaging in a really kind of incoherent and lack of chronology. Kind of, I don't even know what he's doing. I'm struggling to articulate it. He thinks that Plato got it right in terms of a world of forms and a tripartite soul, and he wants to superimpose that onto Germanic paganism with apparently an assumption that Germanic paganism also has a concept of an immortal soul and a tripartite.
Richard, I think you have to be. I think you have to
make heads or tails of it.
Yeah, I think you have to be Greek though,
right?
To be allowed to do that. I'm pretty sure you got to be Greek, a Greek citizen to be able to do that. But continue.
Yes, exactly. I don't have the right passport. The concept of the mortal soul, among other things, you can trace back to what we know of Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism. Many Jews claim that Zoroaster might have been Jewish, and I think there's actually good reason to believe that. He is a founder on one level of monotheism. He's pushing forward towards a monotheistic outlook, as is Plato. And I think this is neither here nor there, I guess, but Nietzsche recognized this. He recognized Christianity as Plato for the people or Plato for the masses. And I think you could reverse that and say that Plato is a kind of Christianity for the elite in his time. He's obviously pre-existing the publication of the Septuagint. He's pre-existing the publication of the Gospels, needless to say. But Plato, throughout the Republic, is very consciously and subtly undermining Greek myth. And you have in the word, he has Socrates as his mouthpiece, but you have this, can we really be worshiping this talk of, Calus being castrated, or Zeus coming home from a adventure and ravaging Hera on the steps of Olympus. Oh, goodness gracious. Could we serious people, who want to worship good gods and so on, really tolerate this? And throughout the Republic, there is, in my estimation, a creation of a kind of Judeo-Christian world outlook. And Plato did invent Christianity in this way. Concepts of heaven and hell, which occur at the beginning of the Republic, and then you can see again in his kind of reincarnation myth at the end of it. Plato, to understand him as a kind of Greek pagan or something, I think is really wrong. I think it's much better to understand him as an early Christian, or rather in a long tradition from Zoroaster through Christ. And that is, in my view, a good way to see him. So this idea of going, it's like you want to get away from Christianity. I understand it. I think a lot of people are motivated of like, the Jews are problematic, Christian morality is for the weak, etc. And so you want to go to paganism. Going to Plato is like going to the source code of everything you apparently oppose. It's going to someone who like set the ideological foundations for Christianity, which Nietzsche correctly recognized. So I don't know exactly what in the hell he's doing in terms of this, like the soul of Germanic paganism, and we must look to Plato for that. I cannot make heads or tails of it. Maybe I should give it another shot and listen to some more of his discussion of it, or read something he's written on it. Fair enough, but I cannot make heads or tails of it. But I think there's just this very strange error going on in looking towards Plato. I think there's reason to believe that Platonism, which obviously inflected early Christianity, that's not controversial. I think there's reason to believe that Platonism also inflected the translation of the Septuagint, that is the Torah that was published in Greek around 250 BC. Plato is profoundly influential in this tradition. And it's not so much that Platonism comes after the Christians. It's more so that Platonism might have inspired the Jews in this important publication, the Septuagint. But I'll leave it there. I'll just say that I don't understand what he's doing, and I think he's just like way off in his timeline, and I think he's very foolishly looking to Plato as some kind of like foundation of paganism as a way of escaping Judeo-Christianity. I just think on all of these matters, he's just fundamentally in error. But unlike him, I'll actually use his name, and I will express my disagreement with him and point him on a path that he could take to reach a correct position, which is more diplomatic, I would say, than the way he treated Mark and me.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're past that point, but because he's one of these DR types who are just like, they get jealous of you and then they attack you. Basically, it's what's going on, right? And yeah. I don't want to be so self-aggrandizing that I imagine that people could actually get jealous of me and that sort of thing. But there's actually no other explanation for the attack, because I don't care about the guy. I don't think about the guy. His work is uninteresting and unoriginal to me. I mean, I don't think that it has no value. I mean, I think it's, if you're interested in archaeology and this sort of thing, that's great. But I don't see the development of any new ideas there. So, I mean, it is what it is. We are developing new ideas, and you're not. You're just pissed off at us. So, but we're hoping to appeal to an intelligent audience, and we're not trying to pander to people and tell them things that they want to hear so that they can be in these little forums and feel like they're Vikings or whatever. We want an accurate picture as to what myth actually represents, and how to use it. And this sort of thing. And I mean, and that is the other tension here, is that and I think a lot of this is just reaction to us. They're just reacting to us. So they're reactive. I mean, an early example of this, I would say, is that your conflict with Greg Johnson, which I think is related to these haters that are kind of like, loosely affiliated with him, mostly in Europe, it seems, whether in England or Sweden, that are kind of like in his group. You took the Nietzschean view of a kind of more globalist or pan-European view.
Yeah.
And Greg Johnson doubled down on petty nationalism, which is a kind of slur. So it's just this kind of weird, that he would actually embrace that term, petty nationalism. And then he would promote it he's sort of like Yahweh coming down on the Tower of Babel, right? Like trying to create division effectively, right? He's trying to create division. Greg Johnson would promote petty nationalism among some of these dimwits that we're hearing from now, and it's obviously petty nationalism obviously doesn't work, right? I mean, we've seen the world wars. It's undesirable, and it's not something that we're interested in. We are opposed to it, and I think that is a kind of root of the guys. The guy wants to retreat into some Anglo-Saxon, specific paganism, of which there's no evidence for what the guy's trying to recreate. It's it's these carvings on rocks and whatever, right? It's even sparser than what we've been talking about or describing.
There's another thing about this, because
well, let me finish it. Let me finish my point, because I think we're going to wrap this up.
But you guys can go on. I need to go pick up the kiddos.
Okay.
So
well,
what about this?
Turn off the recording on.
Just do the same thing you did the last time.
I'm literally going to go on for another sentence here, but
then go on for another.
Yeah, no. So I was just going to sum up. So that divide is the Nietzschean thing. So in the way that I think that Greg Johnson might have actually been reactionary. So in other words, he might have taken a petty nationalist position in reaction to you. I think that's possible. Maybe that's not what happened. Maybe maybe he's a sincere petty nationalist, but he just kind of he kind of put his heels down or stuck his heels down on that position. I think it's similar what's going on with these sort of Platonists, and it's not Tom in particular. I think that Tom is part of that movement, but the Platonists are just kind of reacting against us because we're Nietzscheans, right?
Yeah.
And and we're Apollonians ultimately. We're not just Nietzscheans. We agree with or we disagree with Nietzsche on a few things, but we are not taking a sort of Platonist position, and we can recognize the genius of Plato as a philosopher, and basically creating this field of philosophy and saying some interesting things that are worth considering. But the idea, his concept of the immortal soul in particular is an Eastern import into Greece. It is not, it is not Aryan, you could say, in origin. So that dualism was understood as Grecian or Greek. Or not, or rather, I'm sorry, the opposite was understood as Eastern, was not understood as Grecian, Greek, or Aryan, right? So that dualism was an import. And so, I mean, that's something that, people who listen to Tom and think that he's knowledgeable and this sort of thing, just, weigh these things and consider that this guy doesn't actually know what he's talking about. I mean, let's be honest. And, I hate to be like this, but if you're going to come at me, certainly don't charge at me with, a toothpick like you did, or you're going to get flattened, which you just got. You just got flattened. But I would just suggest that you just not fuck with me, basically, Tom.
That's good advice. No, Bartomeu, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to put a bookmark in it because I've got to go. And I think keeping it on 3 hours is a good time limit. So anyway, amazing discussion, an hour on this question and then 2 hours on the Israel question. So I think it's a really great one. And I will talk to you guys on Thursday. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Goodbye.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
I'm actually a nice guy. Sorry about that, Tyra.